So imagine looking into the night sky. How would you frame the vastness of the universe to someone else? What would you anchor as a frame of reference? The James Webb Space Telescope has given us the sharpest and deepest images of the universe so far, igniting our wonder at the size of the universe. So how would you frame the size of the universe if you were talking to someone? Maybe you'd use a scientific reference, such as the universe is at minimum 250 times the size of the observable universe, which is about 7 trillion light years across. But what if you were speaking to a child? What would you use as a frame of reference then? Maybe a metaphor would work, saying there are as many stars as there are grains of sand on the earth, which includes the sand under the ocean floor. No matter how we try to frame our explanation, there is no single way to convey the scale of the universe, just like there's no one way to position a message in communication. What matters is choosing the frame that is most impactful for our message and our audience.
And framing is how we lead others toward an intended outcome, with the goal of tailoring our messaging for culturally diverse audiences. Now within this, based off of research in cognitive psychology, the way we present information, which is called the frame, affects how people process information, as well as the decision-making capacity of the same individuals. In other words, we must determine what or what not to say about a topic in order to be more impactful whenever communicating across cultures.
So for example, hand sanitizer is a hot commodity these days. So let's imagine that there's 2 bottles of hand sanitizer on the shelf. One bottle has a label that says kills 92% of germs, and the other bottle has a label that says allows 8% of germs to survive. Which one would you purchase, Professor Bullock?
Well, I think I would go with bottle 1, right, 92%, because people like bigger numbers.
So, and this is exactly right, people are drawn towards the positive attributes of a choice rather than the negative ones. For example, research shows us that people are more likely to support an economic policy if the employment rate is highlighted versus the unemployment rate. So we're 2 New York University professors. We've delivered numerous cross-cultural trainings at universities and multinational corporations such as the United Nations. And our research has led us to expand framing as a tool for us to optimize communication across cultures. Now, when we use these tools, we're able to not just communicate more powerfully across cultures, but forge deeper relationships. And this is how we join the next generation of global communicators.
So what exactly is essential in intercultural communications? Right? So today in our globally connected world, we can find ourselves in any number of locations, which requires us to be able to function and operate across any cultural environment. We must be able to adapt and frame and reframe information when necessary in order to connect effectively with different cultures, with people from different cultures. Now at the same time, we want to be thinking about maybe a shared common language might be the solution to effective communication. But research tells us that the idea, in terms of overcoming our common communication challenges, we have to be thinking of something else, which is framing. So for example, what if you were maybe overthinking that email? Or perhaps maybe you were overcomplicating some sort of negotiation you were having. Or at the same time, let's say that you were even trying to oversimplify the next round of presentations, right? Framing is what bridges communication today, okay? And we've studied not only just the way to communicate across cultures, right? But also the way to connect more deeply across cultures with information. So what we're here to do is we're going to give you 3 essential frames to consider that you can use practically to connect better across cultures.
And those 3 ways to optimize communication are through organization, the senses, and the language that we use.
So I'm Dan Bullock. I'm a professor of global business communication at NYU Stern, as well as NYU's School of Professional Studies. At the same time, I also train diplomats, delegates, and global UN staff at the United Nations headquarters.
I'm Raúl Sánchez. I'm a professor of intercultural business communication at New York University School of Professional Studies. I'm also the corporate program coordinator, so I handle trainings between NYU and multinational corporations based in New York. And are you ready to begin? Yes. Okay, excellent. So our first frame, our first way to optimize information is through organization. So to illustrate this, we want to look at the most influential photograph ever taken. This is the iconic Earthrise photo. So this photograph was taken by astronauts of the Apollo 8 mission as they turned around to look at the Earth while they were entering lunar orbit. And the photographer and astronaut, William Anders, he said about this moment, "We set out to explore the moon, but instead we discovered the Earth." Now, this image went as close to viral as an image could at the time. It was flooded by international media across the planet. And the reason that, and it was so powerful, it's actually credited with having started the environmental movement. And the reason it was so powerful is because it was the first time that we'd seen the fragility, the beauty, and the loneliness of our world just hanging there in space. But most importantly, it brought to our eyes and our minds the awareness that we're part of an interconnected system, a global mindset. So in the global marketplace today, we have to bring ourselves to this singular state of awareness, seeing patterns of communication across the globe, navigating those patterns. This is the path of the global communicator today. And it starts with two broad cultural patterns, implicit messaging and explicit messaging.
So with the first framing pattern, implicit messaging, the idea is that this is an inverted cone where a lot of the information is funneled, gradually funneled from the top and going towards a main message. Okay? And within this, the focus is predominantly on ways of synthesizing information, while at the same time developing knowledge through multiple sources.
And this general specific pattern tends to be the communication style preference of most Eastern societies. So just think of regions like East Asia, Southeast Asia, also the Middle East. We have Eastern Europe, most of Latin America, the Mediterranean, the Iberian Peninsula, and the majority of sub-Saharan Africa prefers this communication style pattern. Now, on the other hand, we have explicit messaging, and this is when you're presenting information in an upright cone format. So where the main idea is introduced at the outset, and then it develops into a larger conclusion. And the focus here is on details and thinking about developing an idea from one principle, one source, or one idea.
Now this specific to general framing pattern, right, is very indicative of some specific countries such as the United States, parts of Canada, we would also say northwestern and north central Europe, Scandinavia, Australia, and New Zealand is where you'll find most of this.
And so some day-to-day situations where you can apply this, just think about emailing. If you're emailing someone from a Western society, you might want to think about framing your message in terms of directness, thinking about time, schedules, efficiency. Okay? But if you're emailing someone from an Eastern society, you might think about shifting your communication a bit, focusing on maybe being more tactful and relationships, being a little bit more indirect.
Now let's say, for example, you might be negotiating with counterparts in a Western culture, for example. You might want to take a more task-oriented approach. Now, what this consists of is placing the value on truthfulness and efficiency. At the same time, let's say, well, your counterparts are in an Eastern society, for example. Then you want to shift the focus and you want to shift the format towards building more relationships, a more relationship-oriented approach with the idea of placing the value on trust and respect.
And finally, in terms of presentation skills, as we know, in our globalized era, we encounter mixed audiences in the same presentation space, like we are right now. So the goal is to develop an international presentation style. And if you combine these two cones together, you get what we call the hourglass canvas. And this allows us to have a unified presentation model that accommodates a spectrum of audiences. What's great about it is that it also accommodates deductive and inductive learning style preferences. So the goal, again, as always, is to reach a spectrum of audiences with our communication.
And another way to optimize communication for communicating across cultures is through the senses. So for example, the trick to activating the cognitive centers in the mind, in somebody else's mind in particular, is focusing on schemata, or in the plural sense, we would say schema.
Now, schema is a mental framework, a blueprint for how we can understand information and how we can interpret it. So to illustrate this, we want to do a simple exercise with you. We polled audience members prior to the presentation today, some of you, with a simple statement and a question. So the statement was, I bought a chair. So we want you to just think about the type of chair you pictured in your mind, the color of the chair, the material, the texture, and then we asked, what was the chair that you pictured in your mind? So Professor Bullock, what were some things that people said?
So interestingly, some people said a wooden chair, for example, a metal chair. Somebody even put down, I think, a wicker vinyl lawn chair, something like that. But something that you might find interesting is a black leather armchair.
That would probably be more in my style, I think.
Okay.
So this is the wonder of communication. Our schema, our blueprint for chair, enabled the communication to be successful. But we filled in all the details based on our cultural background, based on our individual preferences, based on our experiences. So what we want to do as global communicators is activate the schemata of our audiences as much as we can. And the way to do this is by communicating information through more than one sense. So through sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. For example, if we're delivering a presentation called Entrepreneurship in the Age of Globalization, the word entrepreneurship may not translate easily across cultures, but if you pair the title with an image of Jeff Bezos and Amancio Ortega on the first slide, as soon as the audience members come into the room, they're able to engage in cognitive connections that activate pre-existing knowledge, linguistic skills, and then prime them for the new information that they're about to receive.
Now, some of the practical ways that you might be thinking, well, how do I frame through schemata? Well, a couple of things that you can do that we suggest in order to build more context using schemata is telling dynamic stories, or perhaps maybe even using powerful gestures. At the same time, you could also focus on your vocal variation. Some other aspects, if you're looking to build a little bit more content and background context, is focusing on providing more background details. Or at the same time, you might want to consider including inspiring quotes, right? Or even to the point of using more sensory language. All of this collectively will help build the context and create more impact for intercultural audiences. Finally, we have our last framing method in terms of incorporating communication to communicate across cultures. And we would do this through language, right? Via global English. Now, the idea behind this is you're probably asking, well, what is global English? Well, global English is the way that the world communicates, for example. A lot of this tends to stem from optimizing and building upon the global business standard. Countries today tend to use this as the way and the mechanism to really communicate across cultures.
And so one way to think about global English and identifying it, the easiest way is sometimes thinking of what is considered non-global English. So for example, idioms, these are those phrases or groups of words that have a cultural meaning that's different from the individual words, like cut and dry, off the top of my head. These can be challenging interculturally. Also, cultural references. Americans love references to baseball for some reason. We talk about leveling the playing field or bringing our A game, or that idea came out of left field. So we want to make sure that if we're using a cultural reference, it's something that's universally recognizable. Also, initialisms and acronyms. So initialisms are when you pronounce a separate letter of an abbreviation, like FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Acronyms are when a word is formed from the abbreviation, like NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So especially at governmental organizations and even at universities, you want to make sure that when we're using a string of abbreviations in our communication, that all of those are clear. And the last is phrasal verbs. These are 2 to 3 word phrases that function as a verb. So for example, draw up, or get ahead, or zero in on. Instead, in our trainings, it's recommended to use a single word verb. So instead of draw up the contract, it's draft the contract, or write the contract. And communicating in global teams, global English is very important to optimize not just communication, but collaboration and hopefully innovation.
So the next time that you're presenting to an international colleague, or maybe you're writing that email, planning that email to send to somebody in another country, for example, or you could even be in the process of negotiating with friends in another culture. We just want you to do one thing. We want you to look up. And we want you to look at the International Space Station that's orbiting in the night sky. Now, the thing to remember is that it's there because the greatest minds across the world were able to come together and innovate and execute on this great idea. Okay, so this global team, representative of 15 nations, 5 agencies, and 1 vision, was able to come together, and you know what? Interesting enough, effective communication emerges within this diverse global team.
And back on Earth, we also have to remember that innovation is a process that occurs across geographies, culture, and history. So when we go forward, we want to think about not just communicating effectively with one another, but as we mentioned, connecting more deeply with one another. Whether we are creating the metaverse, or we are solving the next global climate crisis, or we're mapping out the human genome together. Collaboration across cultures is the key to innovation and to human progress. We shape a better future together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.